So should Hornets fans, at least the ones that want Kemba to take the supermax deal and stay in Charlotte, be more optimistic about that happening based on these recent comments in Japan? And is Gerald McCoy going to turn the Panthers into a contender next season on the field? Those were the two biggest storylines in Charlotte sports last week, and we're going to go deep dive into each one of those with some pretty great guests on this version of the NBC Charlotte Sports Podcast. I am Sports Director Nick Carboni, and we started off with Jared Weiss from The Athletic. He's the guy that sat down with Kemba one-on-one exclusively in Japan, where Kemba made some pretty interesting comments on his upcoming free agency and turned the tide in many people's minds about whether or not he will stay in Charlotte. After that, we've got TJ Rives of Tampa Bay Bucs Radio. He's been a sideline guy there for 15 years. Actually, his Twitter is @Bucs Sideline Guy, and he's going to tell us all about Gerald McCoy, whether or not he can help the Panthers on the field next year and how much, and also how much of this whole coming to Carolina thing was a revenge play. So we'll start it off with Jared Weiss. Enjoy. Jared, reading your piece on The Athletic in Japan with Kemba Walker, a lot of Hornets fans came away reading his comments and becoming more optimistic about the chances that he will actually stay in Charlotte. Should they be more optimistic based on those comments?
Yeah, I mean, if you could read them, then I think it was pretty obvious. So I was surprised. I didn't really know what to expect him to say. I thought he would be more sensitive about the subject. And I think he probably realized what the conversation was going to eventually get to before he sat down with me, and he kind of had what he wanted to say figured out. It was pretty apparent he had given it some thought, and he just said, the Charlotte's his home, and that's where. And the fact that he told me that Charlotte was his first priority, that's what really surprised me. Was I thought he would have played a little bit more coy. Now, who knows if that is his answer before the supermax qualification. I think from his perspective, the difference between non-supermax and supermax is almost his entire previous contract. It's a massive deal to him. Also, at the same time, he's making such an absurd amount of money on this next contract in a way that the difference probably doesn't matter quite as much, but obviously still $40 million is $40 million no matter who you are. As I put it to him, it's a lot more trips to Tokyo on the time. So, the one thing that you can't see in the article that I can remember is just the smile on his face and the genuine. It wasn't like he was bumbling this to me. It wasn't like he was reciting off of a cue card that he got from his agent. He was speaking from. And, I'm not around Kemba as much as you probably are, and a lot of the people in Charlotte are, to, really get to appreciate his earnestness. But it was just so apparent in sitting down with him. He's someone that you can just see the genuine nature behind everything he does and the way that he feels. And it makes sense that he would be someone who he's committed to Charlotte, so he's been so happy in Charlotte that trying to go to a bigger market to get a bigger brand isn't necessarily as vital. Trying to go, ring chasing and trying as hard as possible to set up some sort of situation where they can bring talent. The win wasn't as important. He's earnestly cares about the relationships he has, about the status that he has in Charlotte, and he really is happy with that. And that was something that is really unique to a lot of other players that I talked to.
How much it is unique, and we've noticed that here for a long time, and it's interesting to see somebody from the outside noticing it as well, and noticing that it's different from a lot of pro athletes, especially in kind of a drama-filled, loyalty-less NBA lately. But how much stock do you think we should put into that love for City, that genuine love for this franchise, when there's a lot of other things at play in Kemba's real first foray into major free agency?
Well, I think that he is expecting Charlotte to use their leverage and having the financial advantage to appease him. I think the big thing is that if they tell him we're going to offer you $1 more than all the other teams, it's a big slap in the face. He should they should be offering him just about as much as they can possibly get him. And maybe they don't offer the full supermax. They tell him we want to go $10 million less because it will open up options A, B, and C for us to put people around you so we can build a contender around you more sustainably and more quickly. He's in this weird situation where I'm not so sure how much he cares about building for next year as much as building sustainably, because he would be locking into presumably a 5-year deal. And so, Charlotte is in this really difficult limbo, which is part of why I was surprised that he was basically committing to wanting to stay there to get the supermax, which is that Charlotte's in this weird limbo now where it's it's not really clear how long it's going to take for them to turn this thing around after being stuck at the treadmill of mediocrity for 5 years now, essentially. So he's putting a lot of faith in the team to turn things around. And he deserves to be on a winning team. I'm not saying he deserves he should leave Charlotte. I'm saying he deserves for Mitch Kupchak and that front office to put together a really effective and coherent plan and go after it. And look at what Atlanta pulled off earlier before we recorded this, where they made another trade where their stockpile of assets is so enormous, and they've got 2 really good building blocks here. It's you're seeing the neighbor right next door, or the closest NBA team to you, essentially. They have a very clear vision, and they're doing an amazing job of putting it into action, and the results are pretty promising, at least from a talent standpoint early on. And I think they need to demonstrate that to Kemba. So it's not just about necessarily the dollars. It's about, I think that no matter how happy he is in Charlotte, he still needs to see some sort of cohesive plan for how they're going to get out of this run.
I'm sure you don't spend your days talking to basketball people about the Charlotte Hornets and Kemba Walker. Obviously, for this piece, you may have. So what is kind of the outside of Charlotte perspective within the basketball community about Charlotte's situation, like you just said, completely in limbo with Kemba Walker?
I think Charlotte's looked at as one of the weakest situations in the league because, it's using Atlanta is clearly actually they weren't that much of a worse team, remarkably. Atlanta, Brooklyn, another team that's had a really interesting development plan. Those are teams that really started at the deep bottom, and they've very shrewdly built themselves up, and they have a really promising future ahead of them with the assets or cap space now that Brooklyn has. With Charlotte, there's just nothing there's not a lot to latch onto. I mean, Miles Bridges obviously looks like he has some good potential to be a starting caliber player. Jeremy Lamb has been actually pretty solid so far, and that was a nice acquisition. But unfortunately, Charlotte's just been stuck with that contract hurt them. And I really like Nick Batum, and I thought it was actually not a bad contract when he signed it. Assuming he was healthy the way that he was playing back then, it was a pretty reasonable deal. Now they have, it's Biombo's money that they have at this point, right now.
Yeah.
But it's been, jumping between terrible contracts over time. But it's there's too many terrible contracts clogging up the cap sheet right now between Biombo, Marvin Williams, and MKG having player options. 94 million committed for the 1920 season, and that doesn't leave any room to acquire an upcoming young player, and there's just not the assets on board to make that acquisition either. So right now it feels like Charlotte is back at what are they, square 1.5, I guess, at this point. Mm-hmm. It's not really even clear what square they're exactly at. I think that level of uncertainty is the biggest issue, is that there's just a clear direction forward.
And with this process with Kemba Walker, I mean, you've seen a lot of these play out. How long should Hornets fans, the ones that want to see him get the Supermax and stay, how long should they expect to be kind of sweating this as he goes through this free agency tour?
So he told me he wants to get it resolved as soon as he can, and pretty sure this made the piece, but he said, I asked him, when do you want to have this resolved? And he's like, I'd like to just get it resolved quickly, and so I can go enjoy the summer. And I asked him, when do you think this is probably going to really go down, though? And he said, well, I think the big star names are going to be the ones that fall first. And I asked him, well, don't you think you're one of those guys? And he said, no, I don't think so. That I don't really put myself in that category. So I thought that was really interesting, and I think that he recognizes, as we all do, that I think there's 3 guys: it's KD, Kawhi, and Kyrie. And I think this kind of gets to what you're asking earlier about, like, what do the teams around the league value, Kyrie versus Kemba? I think that even if those players probably are performing at a pretty comparable level at this point, because Kyrie is 3 years younger than Kemba, almost the entire conference, I think that's a huge reason why teams would value Kyrie over Kemba. So on the other hand, Kyrie's leadership has been a massive issue the last few years. While Kemba's leadership is pretty much second to none. Kemba hasn't achieved a ton of success in his career, but I think everybody that watches Charlotte and watches how Kemba conducts himself, they clearly recognize that Kemba is not the reason for that. So it's a really tough balance if you're a team trying to build. Would you rather have the older guy who maybe you won't get the performance value on the back end, but you'll get the leadership and consistency and all that kind of stuff on the front end, versus Kyrie, who there's a lot, teams are salivating over him right now, understandably, obviously, but I just watched up close for 2 years the situation deteriorate in Boston, and that was supposed to be his exciting fresh start outside of Cleveland, to where he was supposed to kind of reach his potential and really be the guy that he wanted to be, and that kind of failed. So, what do you expect now coming out of this situation? It's a lot more tricky.
Now, you say he wants to kind of wait to see what happens, or usually the big guys are first. So that three you just mentioned, Kawhi, KD, and Kawhi. Now, what happens with those three? Could that have some sort of effect on what happens with Kemba Walker? Because the landscape in this league changes every 365 days.
Tremendous. It's a massive impact. I think if Kemba, because it's like, if Kemba is able to go to one of these, like, New York teams or the Clippers or wherever, if the Lakers even, like, if there's bidders out there who didn't get these other guys that we're talking about, then that means Charlotte has to use their leverage of the supermax. If all those holes are plugged, though, and he doesn't really have that big open market, then it's kind of up to Charlotte to basically decide how badly do we want to make Kemba happy if we can get away with offering him a lot less. And so, yeah, that makes a huge impact on his wallet. I don't think it drastically changes the likelihood of him going to Charlotte. It seems that it's really just a matter of, does Charlotte want to commit to him, or do they want to let him go and then completely clear the cap? I think those are really the only two options that they have, because they can't bring in another max free agent. It's either you keep him or you just try to get rid of all the salary you can over the next year or so. And I mean, as great as Kemba is, it might not be the worst decision in the world to try to just like tank for the number one pick, or I guess a top 5 pick, and then try to completely clear all the cap space out. But also, Charlotte traditionally has not attracted big name free agents, and so you're taking a huge risk there and trying to rely on your cap space.
Let's say Kemba does walk in free agency, and I think I think the majority of fans, whether they want to see him get the supermax here or go elsewhere, want to see him do well no matter what. That's what he has meant to this fan base. So what kind of player could Kemba Walker be when he's not sitting on his couch watching the playoffs or watching them from Japan like he was with you? Like, what kind of player could we see Kemba Walker be at this time of year?
Yeah, I think he can pull off pretty much everything that Kyrie and Dame Lillard can. And you look at, like, this playoffs, Kyrie and Dame both had. Well, Kyrie was pretty bad, I guess, for the most part in that second round. But, like, he had some big moments earlier on in the playoffs, and same thing with Dame, where Dame had some. I mean, he had one of the all-time great shots earlier in the playoffs, but then he struggled in the second round. He had one game pretty much, and that was it. And we're seeing that this year, at least, teams are kind of figuring out how to game plan against these elite deep shooting point guards. And Steph, unless I'm forgetting someone, it seems like Steph is the only one that's really consistently dominating. I mean, Kyle Lowry is now playing well again, but, like, Steph's the only one at that position that seems to be consistently dominating. And so, Kemba, I think, would obviously go to the playoffs and be great, and he would be scoring 25 a night and all that, but he would eventually probably face a defense that could neutralize him. And so, like, if Charlotte pulls up and they're able to get into the first round of the playoffs, I expect them to put up big numbers, but depending on who they are able to somehow acquire to put around him, they're probably the defense is going to key in on him, and they're going to force him to take a lot of bad contested shots. and they're going to eventually lose. And so for him, I think he is, if he were to leave Charlotte, it would be so that he can play on a team where they have another elite scorer that could take that pressure off of them, and they could really have more sustainable success in the playoffs.
What about getting him help here? I mean, that's obviously a big part of the equation. They haven't been able to do it yet, didn't pull the trigger at the NBA trade deadline. A lot of talk has been about Washington kind of blowing up Bradley Beal and him coming here. Is there any way to get Kemba significant help before this decision has to go down?
If they could go back in time and win the lottery, that would help. I don't see it. I just don't see it. I wish there was a way, but they just haven't really positioned themselves. I mean, if Malik Monk and Miles Bridges' trade value is really high, with one or two front offices, it's possible that they could pull something off. I don't think that's going to be enough combined with first-round picks to get Bradley Beal. I think there's just other prospects out there in the trade market that are more appealing to those guys, but those guys are both good prospects. I mean, I think a lot of teams are looking at those guys as potential, good starters, playoff caliber starters down the line, or at least useful rotation guys. But like Jason Tatum is out there, for instance. It's just the first example I can think of. Or Pascal Siakam could be potentially out there as well for like an Anthony Davis trade. But if those guys can't pull off those trades, they might be looking at Bradley Beal as their second choice. Bradley Beal is definitely a great example of the kind of player I'm talking about that you would want next to Kemba Walker, who is a really good pick-and-roll playmaker, a great perimeter scorer, doesn't need to play with the ball in his hands the entire time. He can really play off Kemba really well. There's definitely some options out there. It's just that between combining first-round picks and Monk and Bridges as probably your two best prospects, I just don't really think that's quite enough to really get them over the top compared to the other teams in the trade market.
All right, Jared, I'll get you out with this. You sat with the man. You've covered this league. You've covered free agency, maybe not this particular situation that the Hornets are in, but would you have any sort of educated guess as to what Kemba Walker is going to do in free agency?
Man, sounds like he wants to stay. I think Michael Jordan will keep him. I think Michael Jordan will make that offer. Mike wants him. And it seems like Mike makes decisions that might not be what the front office would recommend, but it's what he wants. And I feel like him bringing in Kupchak kind of reflected that a bit. And, I think that they're going to make that offer and he's going to take it. And it's probably the best for both worlds. I obviously want to make the playoffs, and that should be their goal, but I think they have a star that's marketable, that's beloved in the city, and that might be good enough for what Charlotte wants at this point. Maybe once Kemba gets to the prime, or maybe after the cap sheet clears out in a year or so, then they can try to really make a run for it, building up a championship caliber team. But for now, I think it just makes the most sense to give them the supermax and keep riding them.
All right, great stuff from Jared. You can find him on Twitter at Jared Weiss NBA. That's Weiss, Weiss. And you definitely got to check out his article with Kemba if you haven't already. All right, next up, TJ Rives, Bucs sideline guy for 15 years. He loves him. Some Gerald McCoy. He's going to miss him. But, hey, he's going to see him real early on next season, and it's going to be pretty interesting. Here's our conversation. All right, TJ, just from a sideline reporter standpoint and a personality standpoint, what are you going to miss about Gerald McCoy the most?
Can I say everything? Almost like cliche. Look, the guy is one of my faves from having covered this team over the past 25 years. You're not going to find a more likable guy. I know he's received criticism that maybe he is too nice, that perhaps he should be meaner. Although, look, there have been numerous different players that didn't have to be a menace or a maniac in order to succeed. And McCoy is just going to do it his way. And he may help a quarterback up after he sacks him. And that may cause some controversy in Charlotte the first time he does that. But the important part of that whole equation is he sacked the quarterback whenever it happens. So, again, he's been a tremendous asset to the Tampa Bay area off the field, a leader. It's just been unfortunate here that you haven't had enough good football and enough opportunities. I mean, the guy has played 9 years and hasn't been in the playoffs. So he wanted, with this opportunity, to go find a contender. And now here we go with the juicy subplot that I'm sure you'll ask me about, that he goes to a division rival and gets to play against his old team, too.
We'll sure get there. I want to go back a few weeks first, TJ, and it is a business. We all know that. You know that more than anybody. Was it a surprise to see Gerald McCoy get released after 9 seasons?
I think so, yes. I think most people look at this as they're going to find a way to work something out. But in the end, the $13 million price tag was something that the Bucs were just not willing to give for this season, especially when they believed that Ndamukong Suh could give them what McCoy could give them and more for less money. And so that's the reality. We just, in the bigger sense, we have to become, I guess, accustomed to your star players in some instances are going to outlive their affordability by the team, and they're going to move on to somewhere else. And that's the reason why Wayne Gretzky ends up an LA King. That's the reason why on and on we see Brett Favre running around in New York Jets green, followed by Minnesota Viking purple. Sooner or later, they move on. Let us not forget, Patrick Ewing was running around in a Seattle Sonics jersey at the end of his career. Emmitt Smith, I know you know this, Nick, was an Arizona Cardinal. So it takes a while to get used to seeing this happen, but eventually you do get used to seeing it happen, and it will be very weird to see Gerald McCoy in Carolina blue and silver and playing on the other side of the field from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
And conversely, will probably be odd to see another big guy in the middle of that defensive line wearing number 93, but we'll get to that. There's been some comments down there. I know the $13 million was a big part of this, about him slowing down, and certainly he's 31 years old, I believe now. What have you seen from Gerald McCoy the last couple of years, and what can he still bring to an NFL defensive line?
Well, he's 31 years old, and he is still in the prime of his career. And in fairness to him, and I think the Bucs, Jason Light, if he was on with you, the GM of the Buccaneers, would have to admit this, and so too would the previous coaching regimes of Lovie Smith and Dirk Cutter over the last 5 years. They have not exactly had tremendous talent around him. You can make the argument that the great ones don't have to have great talent around them, that they can sometimes transcend that and make everybody better, and I think McCoy does that to a degree. But in a lot of cases, at the position he plays, if a team decides we're going to put two people on the defensive tackle here and take him out of the equation, that's where other guys have to step up. And not nearly enough of that was happening here over the last 4 or 5 years with the Buccaneer defense. In fact, the last couple of seasons, it was the worst pass defense in the NFL, 32 out of 32 in terms of yards allowed, in terms of quarterback completion percentage, fewest sacks, things that you measure how good the defense or the defensive line would be against the pass. So that's not all on Gerald McCoy here. So, to that argument, we'll find out over the course of the next year or two, if McCoy is not having an impact in Carolina, wherever else he is besides Carolina, then that argument grows even more. See, I told you so. But by the same token, the Buccaneers have to hope that without him in the equation, they can be better than what they have been. That's the hope of the new coaching staff down here, that pass defense can be better than what it's been.
Kind of following his free agency mini tour, I guess you could say, it was a lot of AFC North, Cleveland, Baltimore. Then all of a sudden there's this third team in the mix. Then that becomes known that it's Carolina. What kind of went through your head when you heard, okay, Carolina's in the mix now? Does that change things for Gerald?
I thought as soon as I saw, this is easy to say after, as soon as I saw that it was an NFC South team, whether it was going to be the Saints, the Falcons, or Carolina, that's the leading candidate, because he's not going there just because of the weather or to play with Cam Newton or because they can pay him the most money. This is a chance, and ego is part of this. This is a chance to demonstrate that he can still play at a high level against his old team. So there was always a belief down here that he would explore an NFC South team. New Orleans seemed to make a lot of sense because he makes no secret. He's talked about it for years, and he's done it again this offseason. He trains in the offseason with the same training facility and the same trainers as Drew Brees out in San Diego, California. They work out offseason after offseason together. So it has to be that the Saints were not ultimately as interested or very much interested at all, and that's the reason why Gerald moved on to Carolina. But, yeah, to answer your question, when I saw that name on the radar, it made a lot of sense, and it does not surprise me at all that that's the one that he picked.
One of his reasons, he says, for signing with Carolina, obviously he downplayed that a little bit, and we'll get into that in a second, was, team chemistry. And this is a locker room that lost Thomas Davis after 14 years, which in the locker room and on the field is a significant loss for this defense. What can McCoy bring to a locker room in terms of leadership ability? What did you see from him down there the last 9 years?
Oh, I think, he definitely is a guy that others will go and follow. And you see him, and I get the privilege of being down there on a sideline gig with the radio and watch him with his teammates and watch him on the sideline while the game is going on, trying to help his teammates understand what they're seeing with the pictures and now the tablets that have the limited video on them and the pictures on them, and try to help diagnose what's the other team doing, what are we trying to counteract with. He's a leader. He's a leader in the locker room. He's a leader on the practice field and in the meeting room. I think all of those things are reasons why Ron Rivera and the new regime there in Carolina look at Gerald McCoy and say, this is a guy that we want to be a Panther. So, that's something you don't have to worry about with him. You are definitely getting a guy that is going to lift others and try to help others be better.
All right, so at his introductory press conference the other day, he didn't say much about the Bucs. Maybe saying less was saying more in reality, and he's got that nice guy, at least off the field and after the play, personality. But what do you think those 2 weeks are going to be like relatively early on in the season as Gerald McCoy prepares to play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this year?
It's wild because the second week of the season, it's immediately the Thursday night game. After the opener, the Bucs open with the 49ers at home, and 4 nights later we're in Charlotte, where you are, for this game, and that's going to be the entire talk, depending on all things being equal, depending on what's going on week 1. I know Cam Newton coming back is a huge deal and being to full health, but this subplot is going to be the storyline for that Thursday night game. Gerald McCoy at home in Charlotte with his new team against his old team. So that'll be wild. And then, oh, by the way, Nick, the second matchup in London, actually in Tottenham, about 15 minutes outside of London, at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, is in October. Panthers Buccaneers in the UK on a Sunday morning breakfast NFC South special. So both of the games will be featured big time because that Sunday morning game will be a standalone game from London on that Sunday. So it's very interesting and coincidental how it worked out that McCoy chooses the Panthers, and the 2 Bucs-Panthers games will be featured for this season.
And I'd imagine we'd probably be able to get a couple of good sound bites out of Gerald about all that.
It would actually surprise me if he gives you very much the weeks of those games. He is not the guy. He's not a guy to talk a lot of trash, and he's got a lot of good humor with the stuff that he says. Let me give you an example. He's big buddies with Sam Bradford, who he played with at Oklahoma when Bradford won the Heisman. They played in the national title game and lost to the Florida Gators. And so he has long been friends with Bradford. Well, he's naturally going to go against Bradford a couple of times in the NFL and in the pros. And so he really became good friends with Sam Bradford's family, and in particular Sam Bradford's grandma. And so I remember doing radio shows when the Bucs were about to play the Rams, and he goes, I got to put this out there. He goes, I'm saying this already to Sam Bradford's family. I'm sorry for what I have to do to Sam and to Sam's grandma. Grandma, I know you're mad at me, and you make great pies, and I love your pies, but I'm going to have to hit Sam. I'm going to have to tackle Sam. So he made it a big joke that this is the rare opportunity that I've gotten because at Oklahoma I couldn't tackle Sam in practice. So that was the big deal that he made. somehow I don't think he's going to go out of his way to disparage the Bucs, but he's going to make it known that, hey, I'm ready to tackle Jameis Winston. I haven't been allowed to touch Jameis Winston in practice for the last 5 years, but now I'm allowed to do it.
Just a few more questions, TJ, as we wrap up. Just generically, with what the Bucs have, obviously a lot of changes, especially with the coach there. What is the feeling in Bucs, OTAs, mini camps right now as they approach a new change and new regime?
Well, there's a lot of optimism, and obviously it starts with Bruce Arians' work with quarterbacks in the past. I mean, you're talking about a guy that's worked with Peyton Manning, Ben Roethlisberger, Andrew Luck, and Carson Palmer, and all of those guys that he worked with ended up being playoff quarterbacks, some of them Super Bowl winning quarterbacks, and so that's what's being viewed here. Can he get the most out of Jameis Winston after they picked up the fifth-year option on his deal? And look, there's a lot of eyes on this situation that we're talking about. They bring in Ndamukong Suh on a one-year deal, and he's got to live up to replacing Gerald McCoy and the productivity and being good, if not great. So that's being scrutinized also here for a Buccaneer team that, again, has really, they've had one winning season in the last 7 years. So you got to go back really the last 8 years now. You got to go back to 2010 to the last time they had a 10-win season. They had one 9-win season in the last 8 years. So you're trying to turn the fortunes around. Arians obviously has a track record of having had success. And so let's see if it plugs in. There is some, everybody's got optimism right now. The draft has happened. Free agency's happened. We're going to be better. We're going to turn it around. All over the NFL, you believe that. So let's see if it's the Buccaneers' turn to come out swinging here, and it will not take long for the rivalry with the Panthers and the Gerald McCoy stuff to be front and center in week 2 for sure.
All right, TJ, get you out on the juiciest Bucs-Panthers storyline of the week. The Panthers picked up a free agent cornerback, former Buc, the other day. What can you tell us about Javien and his chances to maybe make this team?
Well, I mean, they've gone through a lot of different defensive backs and have continued to draft them. And you're meaning Javien Elliott.
Javien, yes, sorry.
Yeah, Javien Elliott from Florida State is a guy that they use some here and there. So, I'll tell you the one that I think it damaged the Bucs in hindsight in an area that most people don't pay a lot of attention to. When the Panthers signed Russell Shepard, the special teams hitman, back 2 or 3 years ago, and he took the lucrative free agent deal in Carolina, I think it hurt the Bucs special teams because this is a guy that would go down and make tackles. This is a guy that can make returns. He was playing spot receiver when they needed him, including in 2016 when they ended up having a good season. So, sometimes these players swap on the different teams. They swap within the same division. We'll see if Javien Elliott can help out the secondary. Certainly he will be the first one to tell you that it helps to have somebody like Gerald McCoy in front of him when you're trying to cover people down the field because the defensive backs' best friends, Nick, are pass rushers and sacks. and so it makes you look great as a secondary. And look, the Bucs have overhauled their secondary a couple of times in the last couple of years. They have used now 7 draft picks, 7 since 2016 in the first or second round on a defensive back, either a true corner or a safety. So that shows you that Jason Light has been trying, the Bucs GM, to overhaul that secondary with a lot of young guys. So let's see if that starts to come to fruition here with the new coaching staff.
TJ, thanks a ton for your time, and we will see you early in week 2 here in Charlotte.
It will be interesting. It will not be dull. You guys take care of number 93 there. Get him talking about Marvel Comics, which he loves. Get him talking about the NBA, which he loves. And you got an NBA team there too. So, and take care of our guy. There's a lot of fondness for Gerald McCoy in this market for sure.
We'll do. We're happy to have him. Great stuff from TJ, and we're looking forward to seeing him early on next season. Should be pretty wild. Again, his Twitter account, @BucSidelineGuy, BUC Sideline Guy, and he's been doing it for a long time, man. One of the best. Thanks to him, and thanks to Jared, and thanks to you for listening.